Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. All right, so I'm told we're live, and we're going to get underway, start our recording, and we're in Isaiah chapter 23. So let me get my notes pulled back out here. And this is an oracle concerning Tyre. And so we're going to deal with another oracle against one of the nations, and this is going to take us all the way to end times one more time. But let's read the whole section. It'll be 1 through 18. The oracle concerning Tyre. Wail, O ships of Tarshish, for Tyre is destroyed without house or harbor. It is reported to them from the land of Cyprus. Be silent, you inhabitants of the coastland, you merchants of Sidon. Your messengers crossed the sea and were on many waters. The grain of the Nile, the harvest of the river, was her revenue, and she was the market of nations. Be ashamed, O Sidon, for the sea speaks, the stronghold of the sea, saying, I have neither travailed nor given birth. I have neither brought up young men nor reared virgins. When the report reaches Egypt, they will be in anguish at the report of Tyre. Pass over to Tarshish. Wail, O inhabitants of the coastland. Is this your jubilant city, whose origin is from antiquity, whose feet used to carry her to colonize distant places? Who has planned this against Tyre, the bestower of crowns, whose merchants were princes, whose traders were the honored of the earth? Adonai of hosts, Adonai Sabaoth, has planned it, to defile the pride of all beauty, to despise the honored of the earth. Overflow your land like the Nile, O daughter of Tarshish. There is no more restraint. He has stretched out his hand over the sea. He's made the kingdoms tremble. Adonai has given a command concerning Canaan to demolish its strongholds. He has said, you shall exult no more, O crushed daughter of Sidon. Arise, pass over to Cyprus. Even there you will find no rest. Behold the land of the Chaldeans. This is the people which was not. Assyria appointed for desert creatures. They erected their siege towers. They stripped its palaces. They made it a ruin. Wail, O ships of Tarshish, for your stronghold is destroyed. Now in that day Tyre will be forgotten for 70 years, like the days of one king. At the end of 70 years it will happen to Tyre as in the song of the harlot. Take your harp, walk about the city, O forgotten harlot. Pluck the strings skillfully, sing many songs that you may be remembered. It will come about the end of 70 years that Adonai will visit Tyre. Then she will go back to her harlot's wages and play the harlot with all the kingdoms on the face of the earth. Her gain and her harlot's wages will be set apart to Adonai. It will not be stored up or hoarded, but her gain will become sufficient food and choice attire for those who dwell in the presence of Adonai. Obviously, talking end times in those last couple of verses. Before we dive into prophecy, I love background. I think it's important that we understand the background. And so a bit of background information I think is in order. We have a few notes to consider today. And it ends a fairly long section of oracles against the nations, which also included Jerusalem. It won't be the end of the prophecies, but the end of a long set of oracles about the other nations of the world. And this set of prophecies began with Babylon, and it ends with Tyre and Sidon. Babylon to the east, Tyre and Sidon to the west. The greatest maritime and trading empire of the ancient world was Tyre and Sidon. In fact, Ezekiel spends a lot of time talking about the grandeur of Tyre, the king of Tyre. Between the beginning and ending, we have a mix of a world power and wealth, which excludes God from their lifestyle. From Babylon to Tyre and Sidon, we have a mix of a world power and wealth that excludes God from their lifestyle. That was the point of these admonitions, these oracles against the nations. Phoenicia and Canaan came to be used in Hebrew as a symbol for a merchant. And so we find that in a couple places in the apostolic writings, at least for Canaan. Our prophecies have extended again from east to, with Babylon and to the west with Tyre. So our notes. Tyre and Sidon, two of the main Phoenician cities in what is now southern Lebanon. The former was built on an island, that is Tyre, some 600 yards offshore. It lay approximately 25 miles south of Sidon. Both cities served as seaports and trading centers, brokering products from inland as well as from across the waters. The Phoenicians had associations with Israel throughout most of the monarchy period, with Hiram I of Tyre providing aid to both David and Solomon. David to build his palace, Solomon to build his palace, but also the temple. And then concerning Babylon, Babylon was the city of the imperial power of the world. Tyre, the city of the commerce of the world. So they would see Babylon as that vicious, aggressive, warlike nation, whereas Tyre was more interested in gaining the wealth of the world. And so then this former subjugated the nations with an iron arm and ensured its rule by means of deportation. The latter obtained possession of the treasures of the nations in as peaceable a manner as possible, and secured its advantages by colonies and factories. They colonized. It's amazing that such a small little spot could colonize so many people, but it was a maritime power. So the Phoenician cities formed at least 6 or 8 independent states, the government of which was in the hand of the kings. And so we should be familiar, if we remember history back in our high school and college days, we should be familiar with the Greek city-states. And so you had whole empires that were cities. And our study of the Bible should remind us of Ekron and Gaza and Ashkelon and Ashdod, city-states of the Canaanites, of the Philistines. And so this is the way these towns right along that Mediterranean coast were. And so they were like city-states. And so of these, Sidon was much older than Tyre. The Torah, they spelled it a little different in Chaldean time. And Homer mentioned only the former, Tyre. Tyre did not rise into notoriety till after the time of David. But in the Assyrian era, Tyre had gained a kind of supremacy over the rest of the Phoenician states. It stood by the sea 5 miles from Sidon, but when hard-pressed by enemies, you get a little difference in distances in the various notes. But it had transferred the true seat of its trade and wealth to a small island, which was 3/4 of a mile further north and only 1,200 paces from the mainland, so 1,600 yards. Now it says 1,200 paces. Don't know how tall they were to figure out how long those paces were. The strait which separated this insular Tyre from ancient Tyre. So they're out on an island with water all around it, separating it from the coast. And so this separated, was mostly a shallow, and its navigable waters near the island had a draft of about 18 feet. 18 feet, so that on 1 or 2 occasions a siege of singular Tyre was effected by throwing up an embankment of earth, namely once by Alexander. The embankment still in existence at the time that Chaldean wrote in the late 1800s, and once possible by Nebuchadnezzar, for Tyre was engaged in conflict with the Chaldean Empire as well as the Assyrian. So 18 feet deep. I don't think most people realize how important our waterways are to navigation and to trade. And so until that barge hit that big bridge somewhere up in the northeast, I forget where it was at this point. So, pardon? Chesapeake Bay. Then we realized how important that waterway is for commerce up in that area. So 18 feet. And most of these waterways, they have to dig channels for large boats. Particularly down in Florida, the very big lake of Okeechobee is roughly 15 feet deep in most places. So to get the barges in and out of Lake Okeechobee, they cut 40-foot channels out underneath the water. And so this is 18-foot draft, so 18 feet deep for the ships of that day. Then Hiram, another note from Dr. Moitier, Hiram of Tyre always loved David, according to 1 Kings 5:1, and renewed his covenant with Solomon, 1 Kings 5:12, cooperating commercially over the temple. So 1 Kings 9 and following. There was another side. Solomon took Phoenician wives and poured the cult of Sidonian Ashtoreth, according to 1 Kings 11:1 and 5. These high places remained much later time in 2 Kings 23. And Isaiah would have grown up with an awareness of Tyre's corruption of Israel's most favored king, which was Solomon. David was a war king, and Solomon was a peacetime king. And so they recognized the corruption from Tyre. And so Phoenicians' influence was an evil genius to the northern kingdom also, to the extent of almost replacing Yahweh, we'd say Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, Adonai, with Baal of Sidon, 1 Kings 16 and 18. Isaiah, however, looks forward to the dedication of Tyre's wealth to Adonai and his people at the end of our text for today. And he is thus living within the traditions to which he was heir, and indeed reaching back to the normative times of David. So just to understand some of the background as we come into our text. And so we'll move on into our chapter. The oracle concerning Tyre. Wail, O ships of Tarshish, for Tyre is destroyed without house or harbor is reported to them from the land of Cyprus. So when was it destroyed? It's not a big place today. Someone said that Tyre on the island was 4 miles in circumference. So that's a pretty good sized island. And it was the whole island, one city. So if this was true as a massive city for that time period, 4 miles in circumference, we're told the old city of Jerusalem is not that big, about 2.5. So Moyer describes the ships of Tarshish as the largest class of merchantmen and ancient fleets, the largest transport to go over the large ocean and transport goods, and referred to ships capable of the longest voyages. Most references to Tarshish are satisfied by the traditional identification with Tartessos in Spain. And there is where most identify this harbor of Tarshish. Ships making their way back eastward would call it Cyprus before completing their journey to Tyre. In this case, however, they have known from the harbor of Cyprus that Tyre has been destroyed. So smaller ships to go shorter distances and travel faster, and the word travels pretty quick. So the Chittim, written in the legends of coins and other inscriptions with Kaf and Chet, are the inhabitants of the Cyprian harbor of Chittim and its territory. But Epiphanius, the bishop of Salamis in the island of Cyprus, so Epiphanius, one of those early church fathers of the 4th century, and that was living on Cyprus, says that Chittim was also used as a name for the whole island, or even in a still broader sense. So we say Cyprus, they said Chittim. The symbolism Tyre brings to the mix is the same as with all the other nations. Don't put your trust in men or nations. Praise God, Netanyahu is not going to put his trust in the United States. He said, if we stand alone, we're going to fight. And that's the way it's supposed to be. Our trust is in God. God's the judge of all mankind, and those nations who ignore him will be judged. And so expect something to happen to us. We turn away from Israel. Israel is intimately involved in commerce with them to some level, beginning with David, but more fully in times after the exiles. Just so we get a picture of the area that we're talking about, we'll put this up on the board where we can get maybe a little bit of idea. And so to point out, because it's hard to do this map where we can all see it, just below Hermon is the Sea of Galilee way down here. So Tyre, just above there, here's Lebanon, here's Tyre. And it doesn't have Sidon on here, which would be to the north. And you're going through Syria, Damascus, and here's Cyprus out in the Mediterranean. And the lower part of that ground up there is Turkey, Asia Minor, where Paul did most of his missionary journeys. So just kind of give us a large picture of the area here. A very key location, a big harbor. A good harbor is very important. The main harbor in Israel is Haifa. But there's another harbor just outside of the city of Tel Aviv at Jaffa. That's where Jonah got in the boat for Tarshish to run away from God. And so you have very important harbors there, but this is the most important there at Tyre that we're talking about today. So just to kind of give you a visual, I'm very visual. I like to see the maps and the pictures. So while Tyre is said to have paid tribute to the Assyrians, having been subjugated in Esarhaddon's reign, and so we have several key leaders of the Assyrian Empire, one right after another, Esarhaddon the last, they were never destroyed by Assyria. It's been recorded that Tyre withstood Nebuchadnezzar for 13 years, but it was taken by Alexander the Great after a siege of 7 months. Alexander basically dismantled the city on the coast, used the materials to build a causeway out to the island city. It was said that Alexander crucified 2,000 of Tyre's leaders and sold 30,000 into slavery. To give you a little idea of the size of the town. And I forget, I think Montgomery's 60,000 people? 200,000 these days? So Prattville's probably around 30. Don't know for sure. It was then finally leveled, and much later in 1289 A.D. by the Sultan of Egypt, according to Adam Clark. So the first big hit that they had was the Assyrians. It kind of got in the way of their commerce. And then the Babylonians almost completely shut them down, but Alexander the Great was the one that actually leveled the place to begin with. So at this time, Isaiah is envisioning a rather full destruction without home or without harbor. So is he predicting Alexander the Great? Or was he predicting something even later than that? We don't know. We don't know specifically what event Isaiah was speaking, but historically it would have been Alexander the Great that actually did that kind of level of destruction. Verse 2 says, "Be silent, you inhabitants of the coastland, you merchants of Sidon. You messengers crossed the sea and were on many waters. The grain of the Nile, the harvest of the river was her revenue, and she was the market of nations." Now they're silent. No noise. Seaports are noisy places. A lot of activity going constantly. Ships coming and ships going. And all kind of commerce builds up around the area. Think New Orleans. Think Tampa Bay. A lot of things going on in those kind of port cities. So silence is the opposite of a bustling seaport, which would boast of mariners from many other nations as well as their own busy mercantile society. The Hebrew term here translated coastland can either mean coast or island, and so surely represents Tyre, whether it means the one out in the water or the one on the coastland itself is up for discussion, but most likely it means the one out in the water. And so following the other important Phoenician city, we hear about Sidon. Matthew, Mark, and Luke witness not only the people from Tyre and Sidon coming to hear Yeshua, but even of Yeshua going to witness to them. So he went well out of his way from the people of Israel to witness to a Gentile world. The meaning of verse 3 is not that the revenue of Tyre was accrued to it on the great unfruitful sea like a Nile sowing or an Egyptian harvest. Such a simile would be a very beautiful one, but very unlikely one, since the Phoenicians actually did buy up the corn stores of Egypt, that granary of the ancient world, and housed the cargoes that were brought to them upon great waters, that is, on the Mediterranean. So on the river and on the waters of the Mediterranean, they brought the produce from Egypt to Tyre. And from there they would import it all the way to Spain and other nations around off the water. So they would buy up the corn stores. Don't know why Kyle and Delitzsch, they're old-fashioned, and so in the old King James you'd read about not grains of wheat but corn. And it's not talking about growing our yellow corn or the sweet white corn. They're talking about wheat and barley when they use that word. But nonetheless, he's old school with that idea, and they're buying up the various produce that they would grow down in Egypt and carry elsewhere. And then they would carry it through the Nile and then up the Mediterranean. Sychor is a Hebraic form of Cyrus, the native name of the Upper Nile, according to Dionysius and Pliny, the ancient historians. It signifies the Black River, the black slime of which gave such fertility to the land. So those of us familiar with New Orleans and the Delta area of both there and Mississippi, the overflow of the Mississippi is what made that land so fertile in Louisiana and Mississippi. And so that's the same true for the Nile. And so it calls it that dark water, signifies that black river, the black slime. The harvest of the Nile is not so much an explanation as an amplification. The valley of the Nile was the field for sowing and reaping, and the Phoenician coast was the barn for this valuable corn. And as much as corn and other articles of trade were purchased and bartered there, it became gain. And so it used, in the same sense, in various places, the means of gain, the source of profit or provision to whole nations and even to many such nations. And so they became a very wealthy place because of that commerce. The reality makes the whole situation much greater reason for mourning, since they were the transportation of that ancient world to provide grain for the surrounding nations. And so it's much like our own modern situation today with the sea and the rails and the roadways, vital to bring food in to various markets from around our country as well as from around the world. And so in that ancient day, Egypt was to a large extent the breadbasket of that ancient world. That's where the majority of the large stores were grown because of fertility of the Nile Valley. And in modern times, they used to talk about, in modern times, the Mediterranean area being around Egypt and Israel was the seed basket or the bread basket for all of the Middle East. Not since America's been around. Since America became strong agriculturally, guess who the bread basket of the world was? United States of America, which we're not that anymore. At least not American-owned stuff. And so they were also known for their glassware that was created there in Tyre, which they transported to various nations, but also for their trade in purple cloth and timber. Purple cloth. So when you think purple cloth, think of the attire of the high priest of Israel. And think of the blue that's in our tzitzit. Because the blue in our tzitzit and the purple in that robe depends on how long the kilazon snail is exposed to sunlight, which grows in the little areas right off the edge of the Mediterranean Sea. So in our modern times, and only in our modern times, there's been a group of rabbis, and their little business is called Patel Teklet, a thread of blue. And they've understood or renewed the find of that particular snail, and they are producing the blue that is in mine, at least. The set that's on this is very old, and this came from Israel, from Patel Teklet, this particular blue on my tzitzit. And so this was it's rather expensive to order from Israel, but just because this would be the blue that they would have had in that day, that always excited me, and I like to have it from there. Just one of those little ticks that I have. And so the blue and purple cloth and timber from the Lebanon. You know, the cedar of Lebanon is well known for its beauty and its endurance and its longevity. So we remember the bringing of cedar wood by Hiram, king of Tyre, both David and Solomon, for the building projects that they had. So verse 3, 2 and 3, grain on many waters, the grain of the Nile, the harvest of the river was her revenue, and she was the market of nations. They crossed the sea and were on many waters. And then on to verse 4, be ashamed, O Sidon, for the sea speaks, the stronghold of the sea, saying, I've neither travailed nor given birth, I've neither brought up young men nor reared virgins. Why? Because they're going to hear that there's no more a house nor a harbor. So there's no means to raise children. So the sea's personified here. Some suggest the mother of the Phoenicians and others as the strength of the Phoenicians, which it was. They were seafaring people. So their strength was their knowledge and ability on the sea to build ships and to sail them and to carry things from one place to another. So in this prophecy, both Tyre and Sidon are left as a mother bereft of children. That's the point. Not just the feeling of embarrassment, but public shame at the loss and destruction of such a promising source of wealth and prosperity. So a literal translation, according to Mortier, would be, for the sea has spoken, the stronghold of the sea, saying. And so it's like the sea is speaking of its loss because of Tyre being destroyed. And he goes on to say, we may imagine the people often spoke of the sea as their strength and a moat, I misspelled that twice already, a moat defensive to a house. The sea is their strength and defense to their city. The ever-open door supply, should they be besieged on land, the constant source of their wealth. So they moved out to the island with that moat, as it were, an 18-foot draft around that whole island for the ships to come into harbor and keep people from coming out there that they didn't want. So that was deterrent. We're actually told that originally down the Kidron and around the old city of David there was a moat to protect them. In fact, you'll find reference to a moat in the future, if I remember correctly, but I best not even say that. But there is reference to moat around even the city of Jerusalem for protection, much like we find in many English castles. but an ever open door of supply. If they can't get to the mainland, no worries. They got relationship with other nations, and their ships are coming in. And they're a constant source of wealth. But now the sea can only grimly recount the loss of its children. Some suggest it's the Canaanite god of the sea, which is speaking at this point, while possible, I think Mortier has captured the main thought here. So the sea's remorse over the loss of the city of Tyre. Verse 5 says, when the report reaches Egypt, they will be in anguish at the report of Tyre. Why? Because that was their main means of transport and commerce of all that they grow up the Nile. They were dependent to some degree on the Nile and the Mediterranean to move the produce to the surrounding nations for income. And we have to be reminded, the thought just pops in my brain. I thought about it when I was making the notes. We know that Jacob sent his boys to Egypt to survive the 7-year famine. So during that 7-year famine, with Joseph in charge, they were the breadbasket of the world down in Egypt. And so they're going to mourn because no longer do they have the means to move their commodity to the marketplaces of that ancient world. And so they were very dependent upon the water system to move things. The main point, the magnitude of the disaster which befalls Tyre and Sidon affects all the nations around them. Not only would their commerce greatly suffer, but such a catastrophic event concerning their allies would not only mean no commerce, but also mean, well, if they took down Tyre, we're going to be next. So such was true for Egypt from both Assyria and Babylon, and Alexander the Great as well. There's no wonder that on the northern coast of Africa, there's an Alexandria, named after Alexander the Great. Verses 6 and 7 says, pass over to Tarshish. Well, O inhabitants of the coastland, is this your jubilant city, whose origin is from antiquity, whose feet used to carry her to colonize distant places? So that last statement indicates to us everything started at Tyre. And they formed a harbor on Cyprus, and they formed a harbor all the way in Spain at Tarshish. And so these were the ones, a little old place that was able to go out and colonize other places. And it seems to be a call to the evacuation of refugees heading now for Tarshish. The inhabitants of the coastland would have included a few other Phoenician towns much further north than what we had on our map at Tyre, and on up to a little place called Biblios, who would flee for safety to a far distant colony as far away as they could get from their enemy. That was what they were doing, running. Tarshish, the most distant and hardest to reach. Our text then locates the origin of these other harbors and colonies to the central power of Tyre. It's described as your jubilant city whose origin is from antiquity. So Tyre, a very ancient city. It's amazing that such a small area initially could become such a power of world significance. Not like Assyria or Babylon or Alexander, not that kind of imperialism, but rather commerce and money making. So their interest was not in the imperialism. And so we think of Assyria, Babylon, Greece, Rome, or much later Great Britain. Great Britain was the largest empire that ever existed, far greater than Alexander the Great's. They had colonies in India. They had colonies in various islands around the world, in Africa, South Africa. They controlled a vast area at one time. But they were involved in simply establishing a wide expanse of commerce. The love of money was their driving force. And so God judges them. Why? Because the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, Paul says. In this passage, their feet, which used to carry her to colonize distant places, now carry her to escape to one of those distant areas in order to escape the destruction which has come upon the city of Tyre. They run as far away and as hard as they can to get away. Verses 8 through 14 explains just who was responsible for this destruction of Tyre and Sidon. God, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. He calls her into account for her pride. He is, in fact, God of the whole world, not just the Jews, not just the idea that we used to have of God being in charge of America, but he's God of everyone. He's got the entire world, every nation, every human being on the face of this earth. He is the only God. And he calls Tyre into account for pride. Man's insatiable drive for importance, power, and wealth, fueled by his belief that he's in control of his own destiny. I need to make a name for myself. What we really need is to know the name of Yeshua. That's the name that's important for us, not our own. So man believes in general he can take care of himself without the involvement of God, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but he cannot. That's what we tend to think in general, but he cannot. So verses 8 and 9, who has planned this against Tyre? The bestower of crowns, whose merchants were princes, whose traders were the honor to the whole earth. Adonai Sabaoth planned it. Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh Sevaot, the Lord of hosts, to defile pride of all beauty, to despise the honored of the earth. So when Tyre founded colonies, they were ruled by kings which Tyre appointed, hence we could say bestower of crowns. The merchants of Tyre were themselves considered to be princes, the most honored of the earth. Not saying that I like the idea of it, but who doesn't know names like Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Warren Buffett, and Bill Gates? And a lot of people honor them just because they're wealthy. And they have places of vast importance in our country, as if they can control or direct our thoughts and how we're going to vote and how we're going to think and how we want to live. They're not the honored. The more honored of the earth in God's eyes are the people nobody knows but live a godly, holy life down to the end. And there's many others I didn't mention, just names that pop in my head. In the sense of how we know these names was the idea of these main merchants and traders of Tyre, spoken of here, being honored. Honored because of their ability and skill in making money. However, Adonai Sabaoth has planned this to defile the pride of all self-made beauty and self-asserted honor of the earth. The pride of all beauty may well be extended to the elaborate temples that they've discovered archaeological remains of, to be found in the ancient city of Tyre, and ancient historians tell us about. With the wealth that's to be understood in association with these people and their city, no doubt their buildings were quite elaborate and decorated to the extreme. Now, while we might like Trump, I couldn't help but think of Mar-a-Lago if you've seen any pictures of that place with all the gold and bling everywhere that you love. So God will profane their pride and dishonor their honorable. The point is twofold. First, to show the transitory nature of the glory and pride of man. It's foolish for man to trust in his own self-made notoriety. Second is to point to that which is transcendent, which comes from God. Our true importance and glory are found in the Lord God Almighty through Messiah alone, not in money, not in the bling of our homes, buildings, clothing, and such as that. All that we can build in this world is not going to go to glory with us. We'll leave it all behind. And we have this word ha'aretz, the land, which is brought to prominence in these verses, a key to interpretation, according to Dr. Watts, in chapters 23 through 27, the land. The reference is to Israel, Lebanon. I'll just go ahead and put it that way. Everybody hates to use the word Palestine as a geographical reference these days. Extending to the Euphrates in the northeast, and the river of Egypt, and beyond to Egypt in the south. All this land was served by Tyre's commerce, and accordingly, it treated Tyre with deference, that is, to defer to. All the land envied Tyre's wealth and imitated her styles. That's an important statement. Because of her wealth and her grandeur, the land, all the land has been impacted by what happens with Tyre. And so they envied Tyre's wealth and imitated her styles. That was Israel's downfall over and over again. They would go and see somebody else's gods, come back and replicate them. They would see somebody else's way of life, they'd come back and replicate it. So Dr. Watts is suggesting, and appropriately so, this expression from God is not meant for Tyre and Sidon alone, but for all the earth to acknowledge all the land, all the way to Spain, particular that land which God has promised to Israel from the very beginning, Do not place your faith in wealth. Verses 10 through 12. Overflow your land like the Nile, O daughter of Tarshish. There is no more restraint. Tyre's no more. He stretched out his hand over the sea. He's made the kingdoms tremble. Adonai has given a command concerning Canaan to demolish its strongholds. And so Tyre, the old land of Canaan, God gave to Israel, includes the whole area we're talking about, from the river unto the Euphrates, the river to the river of Egypt, and from the Jordan into the Mediterranean coast. And so this whole land, that used to be Canaan. There was 7 nations they were to be driven out. 7 nations to be absolutely destroyed, lest they get involved in the gods and goddesses that had influenced them to do wrong and not to come to God. But they didn't do that. So he's given a command concerning Canaan to demolish its strongholds. And the stronghold in particular we're talking about is the one at Tyre. And he has said, you shall exult no more, O crushed virgin daughter of Sidon. Arise, pass over to Cyprus. Even there you'll find no rest. So he's going to destroy Tyre. Sidon is going to flee. Cyprus is not far enough away. So understanding both the cyclical nature as well as the vast importance of the yearly flooding of the Nile, our translators have translated the word avar, which means to cross over, which gave rise to the word Ivri or Hebrew when they crossed over the Euphrates to come south to where God told Abraham to go. So they translate it as overflow rather than Passover or crossover. The meaning is that the daughter of Tarshish is no longer restrained or governed by Tyre, for Tyre has been destroyed. Adonai stretched his hand over the sea and made all the kingdoms tremble. And so the word translated here is restraint. No more restraint. Overflow you land like the Nile, O daughter of Tarshish. There is no more restraint. He's stretched out his hand over the sea. He's made the kingdoms tremble. You're going to flee. Cyprus is not far enough. He's commanded concerning Canaan to demolish its strongholds. And so you will exult no more. So there's this word mezach, pronounce it correctly here in a minute, restraint, used of a belt, girdle, or waistband. And so this is used of Tyre's hold on Tarshish. Adonai has given an order, a command, that Canaan's strongholds will be demolished. For too long, Israel had depended itself upon the commerce and trade to be found there, and far too long influenced by its gods and goddesses. So ultimately, it's not just because of their sins, but because they caused Israel to sin. They're going to be judged. So the stretched out hand of God, an exhibition of judgment, typically as with the Exodus, we find the outstretched arm of God in judgment upon Egypt. And so he's going to judge. So verse 11, he has stretched out his hand over the sea, made the kingdoms tremble. The sea could represent the water, or it could represent the nations. Sometimes it's used that way symbolically in our scripture. The outstretched arm of God. Boy, when God stretches out his arms, you better humble yourselves and turn to the Lord in prayer, because something's about to take place. And so the restraint's been taken away. The stretched out hand of God typically is with the Exodus. We find the outstretched arm of God with the various plagues and with the opening of the Red Sea for Israel and shutting it down over the Egyptian army to destroy it. So we find both the outstretched hand of God as well as the outstretched arm of God. In Jeremiah 21 verse 5, God says, I myself will war against you with an outstretched hand and a mighty arm, even in anger and wrath and great indignation. The old phrase I grew up with was the long arm of the law. Some of those early cop shows and stuff like that. In a sense, you just can't outrun justice. And so you may outrun that police car, but you aren't going to outrun its radio. And that literally true with the long arm of God. He will dispense true justice and judge those who stand condemned before God. He will dispense true justice, that is, save those who are being vastly mistreated, and judge those who stand condemned. There's described here a lack of joy, a lack of peace, a loss of home, and finally a lack of peace even if they cross over to Cyprus. You're not going to find peace there either. only place you go and find peace is a right relationship with God. And so even there, their sin of pride will find them out. You cannot escape the judgment of God. Whoa, sorry about that. Verse 13 and 14, behold the land of the Chaldeans. This is the people which was not. Assyria appointed for desert creatures. They erected their siege towers. They stripped its palaces. They made it a ruin. Basic reading here, to our eyes visually, it seems as if Assyria destroyed Babylon, which it did. Babylon tried to raise its head many times, and only for the Assyrians to put it down, almost demolish it. And it kept raising up again, raising up again, raising up again, until Assyria began to wane, like the Roman government waned, and then it rose up and took over, and it was the great empire. But they put him down many times. But who erected the siege towers, stripped its palaces, and made it a ruin? Is it talking about the Chaldeans being treated that way by the Assyrians, or is it talking about the Assyrians, rather the Babylonians, the Chaldeans, an ancient name? The Chaldeans is a small area within old ancient Babylon. And so even Daniel was considered a Chaldean in the sense of being trained with the Chaldeans' information and wisdom. But who erected the siege towers, stripped its palaces, made it ruin? Is this the Babylonians, the Chaldeans, what they did to Tyre? It's a question. I don't know a good answer, actually, because Alexander the Great was the one who actually stripped the city of Tyre down. But well, O ships of Tarshish, for your stronghold is destroyed. So two theories on the Chaldeans found here. First, to do with rather the Assyrians, Sennacherib of Assyria, the first to bring about a judgment upon Tyre. Albeit I've already noted, not complete one. He was able to lay the mainland city of Tyre to waste, and many suggest that's when they built the island stronghold of Tyre, when Sennacherib came against them. Sennacherib did much damage to Tyrian trade, but couldn't fully destroy it. We described in earlier studies that Babylon tried to throw off the Assyrian dominance, only to be stomped pretty hard several times. Sennacherib made such an attack prior to his attack on Tyre. Before he attacked Tyre, he put down Babylon. Comfortably so. In any case, some looked at the Assyrian dominance of the Chaldeans as a picture of what they would do to Tarshish. Or to Tyre would be the better thought here. Grogan, Moyer, and Watts hold to this view. The other theory takes its cue from the following verse, where a period of 70 years, we'll read about momentarily, concerning Tyre, just as 70 years was decreed against Jerusalem and Judah. And so they then relate it to the Babylonians because of the period of 70. And so from Dr. Buxbaum, Isaiah calls the Babylonians by their archaic name Chaldees, who originally inhabited the northeastern mountains of Mesopotamia. Later driven out by the Assyrians and forced to settle along the lower Euphrates, the land which became known as Babylon. This is why they're called by Isaiah a people that was not. That is, a people who once were obscure, who will, with their huge war machines and siege towers in the future, destroy Tyre. Actually, Nebuchadnezzar besieged Tyre for 13 years and forced Tyre into submission. This was the beginning of its decline. Although Tyre survived and later regained some of her old trade and stature, she eventually succumbed to Rome, together with her colonies, according to Dr. Buxbaum. So, boy, Tyre was knocked down, knocked down, knocked down, knocked down. Kept getting back up to some level until Rome, and others say the Sultan of Egypt, 1289, kind of did the final death knell. So obviously, Buxbaum and Kalandidish hold this view, that it was Babylon who was going to be the perpetrator of this destruction that we're being talked about here. The destruction which Tyre was submitted to, based on the description we have in our scripture, would correlate more completely with the time of Alexander the Great. It completely destroyed them. But verse 14 brings us back to the original wailing of the ships of Tarshish is in verse 1 of our passage. And so this brings that section to a certain conclusion. And then we come down to the remaining verses 15 through 18. So I don't give you a good solid there. It's kind of hard to figure out. And there are passages that are like that. Some people are going to say, this is the way it is. I'm not, because I'm not positive myself. Verses 15 through 18, now in that day Tyre will be forgotten for 70 years. They just kind of people forget about them. They don't have that impressiveness anymore. They don't stand up and take notice anymore. Like the days of one king. So like the days of one king suggest a specific 70 years, not symbolic. At the end of the 70, it will happen to Tyre as in the song of the harlot. And so this song seems to indicate her trying to regain her prominence, trying to renew relations with those nations. And so this is put in poetic form. Take your harp, walk about the city, O forgotten harlot, pluck the strings skillfully, sing many songs that you may be remembered. And so she's just trying to renew relationships. It will come about the end of 70 years that the Lord will visit Tyre, and not judgmental visit here, just a visit. Then she should go back to her harlot's wages and play the harlot with all the kingdoms on the face of the earth. Now that language suggests sin. But the idea of her harlotry was to gain wealth. Prostitute for money. And the whole idea here is money. The whole idea here is gain. The whole idea here is prominence. So some suggest that the use of the word harlot here, which is so irritating to our ears, may not mean the same thing that it did in most seaport cities or any big city. But she's going to once again engage the nations of the earth. And why they say that is because verse 18 says, her gain and her harlot's wages will be set apart, made holy to Adonai. Kadosh. It will not be stored up or hoarded, but her gain will become sufficient food, choice attire for those who dwell in the presence of Adonai. Well, that's end-time language. We'll show you why in a few moments. So the last verses have the same two theories of interpretation. One theory projects the Assyrian time frame, while the other one projects the Babylonian time frame. A time frame of 70 years is mentioned twice in our text. Tyre will be forgotten for 70, then revisited at the end of the 70 years. That's exactly what God said he was going to do to Jerusalem. End of 70 years. Jeremiah 25:11, the whole land will be a desolation and a horror, and these nations will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Jeremiah 29:10, for thus says Adonai, when 70 years have been completed for Babylon, I will visit you and fulfill my good word to you to bring you back to this place, which happened only in part under Ezra and Nehemiah, with the preaching and the prophesying of Zechariah and Haggai. 2 Chronicles 36:20-21. Those who had escaped from the sword he carried away to Babylon, and they were servants to him and to his sons until the rule of the kingdom of Persia, meaning Cyrus the Great, to fulfill the word of Adonai by the mouth of Jeremiah until the land enjoyed its Shabbatot, its Sabbaths. All the days of its desolation it kept Sabbath until 70 years were complete. God gave the land of Israel its Sabbath rest, its Shemitah, for 70 years because Israel didn't do it. In Daniel 9:1, in the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus of Median descent, who was made king over the kingdom of the Chaldeans, the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, observed in the books the number of years which was revealed as the word of Adonai to Jeremiah the prophet for the completion of the desolation of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. And then in Zechariah chapter 7, verse 5, said to all the people of the land and to the priests, when you fasted mourn in the 5th and 7th month, these 70 years. Was it actually for me that you fasted? Fasted because of the sins that caused their exile. So these scriptures reveal a literal fulfillment of the words first given to Jeremiah. In light of that, we might well expect the same for Tyre. To begin again with the Assyrian proposal, those 70 years are ascribed to the time period of Sennacherib in 701, and the decline of Assyria and the consequent recovery of Tyrian strength about 630. So they gained a little strength back once again. The phrase as or like the days of one king suggests a literal rather than symbolic number. Notice that Adonai visits Tyre, and she returns to her financially lucrative way of life once more. So we note the words for harlot's wages and trade in our text with the word gain. Harlot's wages, trade, and gain. Playing the harlot literally with all the kingdoms on the face of the ground. And so we'll give you a literal in a minute. Very harsh words for the coming around with the abundance of wealth once again, but this time the wealth will be to supply materials for the temple at the time of Jerusalem's return from Babylon exile. That's the take of Keil and Delitzsch and Buxbazen and others. So the end of the 70 years, Tyre is strong once again, and because we're told in Scripture, Ezra 3:7, then they gave money to the masons and carpenters, and food, drink, and oil to the Sidonians and to the Tyrians to bring cedar wood from Lebanon to the sea at Joppa, according to the permission they had from Cyrus, king of Persia. So they're back strong enough again to bring timbers, which would locate it then with the Babylonian period rather than the Assyrian period. Deuteronomy 23:17 through 18 says, none of the daughters of Israel shall be a cult prostitute, nor shall any of the sons of Israel be a cult prostitute. Yet there's male prostitutes. You shall not bring the hire of a harlot or the wages of a dog into the house of Adonai your God for any votive offering, for both of these are an abomination to Adonai your God. So surely, how does that fit our text? Because God says, don't bring that money in here. Buxbazen believes it was when Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in 539 B.C. that Tyre was set free and regained some of her former international position in the world trade, just as he set the Jews free to return and rebuild the temple under a later Persian ruler, the whole city of Jerusalem as well, and both see the blessings of Tyre's provisions in rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem. It fits, because we have Scripture that says it fits. Moltyer sees this last line as a reference to a transformation of the harlot. No longer hoarding up her own wealth, but Tyre's earnings being set apart for the Lord. And so the little Hebrew verse 18, I told you I'd give you that, states Tyre's hire will be holy to Adonai. Kadosh. Uses the word Kadosh. Oswalt quotes Young, saying Tyre now stands in relation to Jerusalem as her colonies once stood to Tyre. As the colonies were subjected to Tyre, Tyre is now subjected to Jerusalem. The wealth flows to the mother city. It's holy, set apart, consecrated to God's service. That suggests a transformation. That suggests end time. So the book of Isaiah is resplendent with the theme of the Gentile nations coming up to Jerusalem to worship and to make their treasures available for the use of the chosen people and for the temple of God. So whether to some extent there was some measure of that at the close of the Babylonian exile and the rebuilding of the temple, that second temple, or not. And it's kind of hard to be adamant. We understand that at the end of time, Tyre, along with other nations, are going to bring all of the wealth into the New Jerusalem, all their glory to New Jerusalem, all their worship to New Jerusalem, no longer to their idols, no longer to their own areas of worship, whether on the hilltops or in great cathedrals or various ways of building to worship in. They'll make it available to God. God's ultimate plan for Tyre is to bring her into line with the central purpose for Israel. We must note, however, that these passages which follow and are looked to in understanding this final verse relate not to the second temple, but the time of Yeshua's return and Jerusalem's glory as Yeshua's capital over all the earth. That second temple never had quite that prominence. In fact, it unfortunately was, after the time of the Maccabees, quite full of corruption. Psalm 87, verse 4. I shall mention Rahab and Babylon among those who know me. Behold, Philistia and Tyre with Ethiopia. This one was born there. So Rahab, Babylon, Philistia, and Tyre with Ethiopia will be a part of the family of God. Isaiah 69 through 10. Surely the coastlands will wait for me, and the ships of Tarshish will come first, to bring your sons from afar, their silver and their gold with them, for the name of Adonai your God, and for the Holy One of Israel, because he has glorified you. Foreigners will build up your walls, and their kings will minister to you. For in my wrath I struck you, and in my favor I've had compassion on you. And so they're going to be bringing things to worship God and to build that beautiful place in the future. Seems most likely to me that these final end times that we're speaking of in these final verses, when the nations of the earth will finally come to recognize God as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and will come to worship him in Jerusalem, that's being alluded to in these last verses. While we see a hint concerning those from Tyre and Sidon who come up to the Galilee, to hear of Yeshua and experience his miracles, we don't find the reality of these verses in that time frame. We don't find them bringing their wares and their glory and their money to Jerusalem in the time of Yeshua, where they come to see Yeshua. Maybe a hint of what's going to happen in the future. So to what extent, the only thing I can say for sure is that there was a Tyre and Sidon present and able to bring timber, cedar wood, to the building of that second temple. So it would seem to me that the most likely connection would be with the Babylonians, and that they had regained some notoriety at that time enough to be able to provide for them what they needed to build that second temple. When God said 70 years, and God said, you'll come back, and God instilled in them to build that second temple, he provided the means for it. And it would seem to me that this passage dealing with Tyre and Sidon is just a part of that plan of God so that they could build that second temple the way he told them to do. But I'll end with that note then, and I know it's been quite a little journey up and down the stairway to get here, but see if you have any questions or comments today. Hopefully I've made sense. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Something along that line. I mean, the word harlot suggests something other than that, but I think it's being used symbolically at that point to mean, whatever commerce they were doing. So rather than build themselves up or anybody else up, they were devoting it to the temple. So they were back to their way of life, which was primarily seafaring. Primarily they were seafaring people and a commercial business par excellence in that time. Anyone else, questions or comments today? All right. Confused you good, did I? If you would, please, we'll